Okay, I'm going to go over the workflow for color negatives and scanning with the Epson V750, V700. There's a new V800 now. They're all basically the same scanner. Um, this workflow, we're going to actually cover all of the little extra things you can do to squeeze every last little bit of quality out of this scanner. It's an okay scanner, but if you go to a lot of trouble, a few extra steps, you can make really great scans out of it. One of the reasons I actually like working with it is that if you actually use ViewScan software and Color Perfect software together, I feel like, at least in terms of color negative workflow, it makes some of the best files, smoothest, best color, most accurate color. So that's one of the reasons I like using it. There are a few little tricks for getting the most out of the scanner, which we'll be going over. The first one that you want to keep in mind is you should probably get a better scanning film holder. This is the little film holder. In other videos, I demo how to do wet mounting and also dry mounting. I also cover how to make sure that everything in this little, we're looking from a bird's eye view downward onto this negative holder. And when you scan, I've found out, especially with color, that if you've got any little holes, like these little finger holes sticking out, you can actually get flare, a very mild case of flare, but one that actually puts color cast in your image. So I demo in those other videos the mask that I put on top of this. I think if you do the dry mounting or the wet mounting with the better scan holder, they're pretty. It depends on how beat up your negative is, but they're pretty decent either way. I feel like if I do the dry scanning, maybe it's not quite as smooth and glowing in the highlights, but maybe there's a tiny microscopic little edge of sharpness that you can achieve by doing the dry scanning. In either case, I'm taping them to this piece of glass and I'm masking out the edges with black masking tape. If you want to use blue masking tape, that would be really cool because you can get a nice little color shift along the edges. So select black masking tape. The other thing that we're going to need is ViewScan software. This allows us, I think, to make a really quite a bit cleaner and more accurate raw file. And that's all we're after right now, is we want to make a raw file and then go into Color Perfect. If we were doing black and white, we'd be using the Make TIFF part of Color Perfect, but that's not what we're going to be doing today. So let's go down to the dock, and I'm going to pull up a scan that I've already made. What's important about this part is you basically just want to get the settings that I've got here. Like, to me, that's the main reason you actually want to watch this video. We start with the Input tab. You can see I've done a preview. If you see something really different looking, like not all the features are there, you might want to check and make sure that the options are set to professional and not basic. If you have a problem with this program, just quit it and restart it and then do a new preview scan. Okay, so we're professional. We're scanning the file. It recognizes the scanner, and here we're not making a flatbed scan, and with these scanners there's two lenses. This is for scanning right off the glass. If you've got an 8x10 negative, this is the one that we want. There is confusing information in the Color Perfect website about whether to make a raw file that is color negative and slide film. They say it doesn't matter because their software is going to convert it to the same thing either way. I think there might be a little bit more accurate file if we set this to color negative. So I'm scanning color negative, and I would set it to color negative. With other scanners, if you actually just set it to scan a raw scan, it will scan everything so that it is basically in a chrome or transparency mode. We're going to set this to color negative. We're going to set it to 48-bit RGB. I'm doing a slow, medium speed preview that has no impact on the final file. The scan resolution is 300 dpi, or excuse me, 3200 dpi. And this is a little bit optimistic for the scanner, but I'm going to show you why we're setting it a little bit high. You can set it higher, but I think if you do, you're kind of creating a little bit too much work for yourself and kind of working against what the scanner does well. So I'll talk more about this in a minute. So leave that 3200 dpi. These settings here. Now, the key to making this scanner in general a much better scanner is this little window right here. It's called number of samples. Now, number of samples means I can tell the scanner to scan multiple times. The idea being is that if the sensor moves across the image and scans, it scans in one pass. As it does that first pass, sometimes it does a really good job of creating information, and sometimes it doesn't, especially if there's like weak, thin shadows. It creates a little bit more noise. If we tell it to go back and scan the image a second time, what happens is it goes back and it reads each sample that it's made on the first pass through this scan, and then if there's color errors or stuff that's not captured well, it resamples them again and it blends it together and creates a much better scan. So that's a really good thing in terms of like making a smoother, more accurate, and also less noisy scan. The other thing that we want to make sure we have checked, especially if we've got contrasty negatives, and I feel like this works very well with color negatives, is you want to check multi-exposure. Now what multi-exposure does is it will, let's say I've got an image that's very contrasty. If I set this to do 2 samples and also multi-exposure, it's going to do the first scan. The first scan might be really high key or it might be really dark, depending on what happens first. But basically, it's going to scan this thing, and it's going to scan it in high contrast mode and a low contrast mode, and it's going to blend the two scans together to give you a much longer range of contrast, or a bigger D max, or a larger dynamic range. In other words, it'll make the highlights easier to print and also the shadows easier to work with. So this is what makes this scanner dramatically better. Okay, we're kind of cheating on the resolution, but we're going to make it take 2 scans at least. If I'm doing this as for super high quality and I've got a negative that's got a little bit more contrast, I might set this to 4. This makes for a really long scan, but you're going to get a little bit more smoothness in the extreme areas of the highlights and also the shadows. Right now, this negative I think is actually really pretty well controlled, so I'm actually just going to sample it 2 times, and I'm also going to do the multi-exposure, which puts a little bit more information in my highlights and my shadows. I wouldn't mess with this because as we do a raw scan, it's not going to matter. The reason that I'm not sampling more times, 4 times or whatever, is that basically this negative is going to move in a tiny microscopic way. And if I tell it to make 4 passes as opposed to 2, I might capture a tiny bit more smoothness and a little slightly richer scan, but it'll be at the expense of a little bit less sharp scan. So for me, this in most situations is the best multi-scan setting. So 2 samples, set it to multi-exposure. If you need more highlight room and shadow room, I might try setting this to 4. Okay, all of these other tabs do not mean really anything when we're doing a raw scan. So in other words, I can actually use some of these settings to get a much better looking preview. This doesn't mean anything when we're doing a raw scan. So let's go to the output. Right now, this is all we need to know. Is I come here and I set this to raw file, and everything else that you see here is what we want. 48-bit scan. Basically, this is all you need to set. When I set this to raw file, unlike some other programs, the raw file is going to be created as a TIFF. Okay, so it's not a true raw file in the sense that it's got its own proprietary tag and you can't save over it. So that's probably something to kind of keep in mind. We're going to need to set a place to save it, and you want to give it a title. Once you've done a preview and you make sure that everything is nice and square and that you haven't got any areas of clear film, you don't need to retape it or re-clean the glass, then go ahead and hit the scan button. Okay, so I've already scanned this, and I'm going to go now to let's go to the bridge. This is where the file got scanned, and what I'm going to do to kind of keep myself from ruining my raw scan is I'm just going to duplicate this file right off the bat. And this is a big old file. It's going to be slow to work with for a little bit. We'll fix that in a few minutes. So as this is duplicating, one of the things I like to do is I might tag this with an extra tag like ORGB so that I would know that it was the original RGB raw scan. And as soon as I start working on something, I'm going to title it with the tag WK. If I've sharpened it in a very specific way, excuse me, I might put SP in there. Okay, so let's actually leave that tag just how it is. Now, these are not like the Imicon files. We can actually just drag them into Photoshop and open them right up. Okay, and like a true raw file, this thing does not have a profile embedded. That is exactly what we want. I've got my my color management settings set up so it'll warn me every time I bring in an image that does not have a profile. And right now it says, what would you like to do? Do not assign it any of these profiles. I want to do it in a very specific way, and we'll do that in just a minute. So we're going to select leave as is, don't color manage, but we'll say thank you for the warning. Okay, so here it is, and it looks a little scary. You can see I messed up a little bit on that edge, but we should be fine. I'm going to rotate the image, and I need to, in this case, go back to image rotation and flip the canvas on its horizontal axis. I have the mirroring set up so that I need to do this. Okay, so at this point, I think it's a good idea to crop out any information that's not the negative that you want to work with. So in other words, if you've got a piece of clear film, like complete open shadows, or you've got a piece, really dense piece of highlight, or perhaps even piece of the tape, we don't really want that to be part of the way that we're going to color correct this file. And we don't actually want to have to deal with those kinds of issues when we go into Color Perfect. So I'm going to crop them out. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to convert this to Adobe RGB. This, in all the workflows that I teach, is the only example where I'm actually going to come down from the main menu, Edit, and we're actually going to choose Assign Profile instead of Convert to Profile. Assign Profile is really dangerous, and if you don't know what you're doing, you can kind of mess up your image. What we want to do right now is, instead of selecting, I've got this set up to work on digital camera files, so I need to change that in a minute. I want to actually convert this to Adobe RGB. Sometimes you'll notice it will change dramatically and look like a really nice color negative, and sometimes it won't. It really just kind of depends. In this case, because we scanned it as a negative, I think it responded in a more dramatic way. So just select this, hit OK. Now, I've got my settings set up. Let's actually talk about that for a minute. I'm going to hit, well, let's go back to the main menu. I'm going to pull up my color settings. And this controls how my conversions are made. Right now, I'm going to set my working space back to Adobe RGB, because that is the space we use for all of our color negatives. And what I want to make sure is set before I did that last conversion. That was kind of a mistake if I didn't know what this was set to. Perceptual is the very best conversion option for our color negatives. There's two that we'd want to use or investigate. If the tonality of the image was more important than the actual smooth transition of color, you may want to investigate selecting relative color metric, but I think for all of our color negative applications, we want to have this set to perceptual. So my working space is Adobe RGB. If I used other types of images, a CMYK or a gray, those would be the settings we'd have right now. You can see I've got my warnings set up here. All we care about is perceptual and Adobe RGB. Okay, so that tells Photoshop to view everything that I'm doing as I work on this file through the eyes or our color profile of Adobe RGB. And we've also converted the image to Adobe RGB, so there will be no mismatches. Next step is to come up here and go to Filter, CFS Systems. This is where the plug-in program Color Perfect lives. Select Color Perfect. Okay, and this sort of remembers the last settings that I used. I was working on an older negative. When you open this up, you want to make sure you see color negative, you want to see Adobe RGB, and you want to see L. You can set it to gamma, and that is actually not what we want to do. So make sure it's set to L. It looks crappier here. This looks very sexy, but this is not the way we want to process a raw scan. This is the right type of film. Okay, so I open this window up and I select, oh yes, there's my manufacturers. But I've got an older film selected. Right now I'm shooting Portra 400, the new one, which is totally amazing. whether you're shooting 35 medium format or 4x5. If you're shooting Portra 400, let's say 2014 onward, select that one, and that you see is that got rid of a little bit of the weird saturation that was kind of flaring up. It looks a little desaturated now, but that's actually fine. That's okay. That's what we want. So when we use this product, we're going to make something that's really super flat, but we're going to color correct it and adjust the tonality in Photoshop in a minute. Our goal with this program is to complete processing this thing in a linear way. Now, linear way, another way to think about that, means flat and boring. Okay. What we want to do is we want to get our highlight and our shadow to be very open and very neutral, so that we can, when we actually do color correct it or make some tonal changes in Photoshop, that we're not fighting against having too much contrast or too much saturation right from the start. So this will look painfully boring, but we're going to take it to a much happier place, as Bob Ross might say. Okay, so my first goal is adjust the highlights, and this software is really horrible, and that's another one of the reasons that I'm embarrassing myself in making these videos. All you need to know about the color negative workflow with Color Perfect is you need to set the endpoints. You need to set the highlight and also the shadow. Up here is the highlight, and we're going to adjust the highlights by adjusting the black slider. So that's counterintuitive. Don't even think about it. So what we want to do is we want to make this number be 0. This number would, if this number is 0, that represents that my very brightest highlights, where I want to hold on to detail, have actually still got some detail. Right now it says that they're clipping by maybe half a stop. Okay, so here's what we do. We select this type. Do not click on any of the buttons. You're always going to just mouse click and drag and select the type. And then I'm going to grab this super high-tech looking slider, and I'm going to pull it downward. And as I do, I'm going to look right up here, and I'm going to go slow and deliberately, and I want to watch as I'm mouse clicking and dragging down. And I want to watch as I get to very close to 0, and I want to get that thing right at 0, sometimes maybe a little bit more. Oops, that was too fast. I'm going to go back up, and I want to find the point. Okay, there is 0.1. Since this image has got a real tricky little highlight, I'm going to go to 0, and then I'm going to go just a little bit past, just a little bit of extra safety room. Now, if you've got some really super dramatic situations where you got two kinds of light and it's very, very bright, you might want to investigate using the highlight stops range clip mechanism. You open this window up. Sometimes you can't get to 0, sometimes you can. But if it's still like clipping and looking really bright, you can select, oh, give me a half stop highlight compensation, full stop, stop and a half. You're going to need to experiment and also go back to the website and check this out. Or just multiple trips through Color Perfect would probably be fine. Okay, so this is set to 0. Sometimes you can't get it set to 0. Sometimes you get a nice big chunk of dirt or dust up in the sky, and you'll be pulling down on this lever forever, and that number will not change. If that is the case, you want to go back to that point where, you know, the number stops, like say it'll stop at 0.03, and you pull down this little slider forever, it doesn't move. You want to go back up and find the spot where this 0.03 just barely starts to get stuck, and maybe be just a little bit lower than that, just to be on the safe side. Okay, so you're not always going to get these nice clean numbers like we're seeing in this example. Last thing to do here is to select the text for BP tails, and that stands for black point tails. That another way to describe that is like this is how the contrast in our shadows works. Okay, so like tails is another way to describe the very darkest part of our tonal scale, like zone 3 down into zone 0. What we're going to do again is I'm going to look right here and highlight this text to activate this slider. I just drag this down slowly, and I keep my eyes glued right here. So here we go, and I'm trying to go slowly. This is exciting. I'm getting stuck probably at 0.2. No. Oh, I got it. Okay, what a nice negative. All right, so I'm going to go just a tiny hair past that. And you can see this is really pretty awful looking. But again, we're just trying to make this super even. So when we say linear, You notice how that most of the midtones earlier were kind of in a nice even progression, or they separated out nice and evenly. But then when we got to the shadows, they got very contrasty and got dark very quickly. And the highlight got blown out very quickly relative to the transition from, like, bright area to super bright area. This is what a nice linear scan looks like. It's a nice even progression for the very brightest highlight, our mid into our midtones into shadows. It's very open. So this is what we want. We want to be able to add contrast to this once we've done a general color correction. So we're all done here. We just do, again, to review, we do the black point, which controls our highlight. Drag that to 0. We're going to do BP tails. We select that text and drag it down until we see 0 here. And then we hit OK, and we will go back into Photoshop. So when we set up the scan, one of the things that I did is I scanned at 3200 pixels per square inch. And according to various experts, this is a very optimistic setting in terms of the actual resolution that the scanner can give you. If there are some people say that it can give you, 2400 pixels per square inch or 1800 pixels per square inch. Whatever the case, we know that we've done an optimistic scan. In other words, we've basically made the scanner take lots of extra steps. And when we do this, it can sometimes soften the image. It can also capture a little tiny bit more detail. And so there's a little bit of a compromise here. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a little trick that's left over from early days of digital photography. I purposely scanned this at a little bit higher resolution. I've captured a tiny bit more information, but it's a little bit fuzzy information. So to kind of fix that and to also start our image sharpening process, I'm going to come up here to image size dialog. And right now you can see that, we'll set this to inches. The scanner spit out an image, or created an image with 3200 pixels per square inch at roughly a slightly smaller than 4x5 image size or scan size. What we want to do is we want to sharpen this thing up. We purposely scan and capture too much information, knowing that maybe we'll get a little bit more texture and detail, but it's also a little bit fuzzy. So this actually presents an image that's kind of hard to sharpen. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to throw away some of the information. And what we're going to do, instead of sharpening, we're going to downsample a little bit. And when we downsample, we're going to select this algorithm, bicubic sharper. When Photoshop downsamples this image, it's going to apply a little bit of sharpening. As it downsamples, it takes the information that's in this larger file. It's a little bit fuzzy. It's going to make it sharper. We're going to throw some pixels away, but we're also going to make it sharper. Right now, I've set this to %. One of the smartest things you can do if you're upsampling or downsampling is to choose an even exponent of 100%. So ideally what I would do is I'd just type in 50%. And you can see, wow, that makes, the image is smaller, but you can also see that the sharpening makes it look quite a bit sharper. Okay, this is what I'd probably recommend, is just setting to 50% and then hitting OK. If you are finding your negatives that are difficult to sharpen in Photoshop, you might want to try what I'm going to do right now. And that is setting this to 75%. And this is not a complete even exponent, but it is pretty close. Basically, I'm throwing away 25% of the information. And then I'm going to hit Command-Option-I, and I'm going to bring up that image size dialog box again. And I'm now going to do the same thing. I'm going to do a reduction of 25% by 2 different times. And the reason I'm doing this is it's going to preserve the image integrity by going in even 25% increments. That sort of breaks down on this second sharpen, but what I'm doing is I'm basically downsampling 2 times in a small way, and I am getting quite a bit more sharpness by downsampling and also sharpening at the same time. So in a lot of my experiments with how to sharpen these images, this I think is the very best way to get started. Now we might want to apply a little bit more sharpness throughout this image later, or just paint some in. But this is the very best basic sharpen. And it also reduces our file size quite a bit. So if I pull it up, the image size dialog box again, let's actually throw this into workable dimensions. You can see I've almost not quite cut the resolution in half. And what I've done is I've decided that throwing information away is and sharpening is a nice way to get rid of some of the softness. This also gets rid of some of the color noise. But more than anything else, this does the very best kind of preliminary sharpen of this fuzzy scan. Put this into workable terms. Let's say the biggest print I can make at 240 per square inch is, I can make it 28 by 35. That's not bad. If I set this to, let's say, 180, okay, I can get up close to the Art Star range. If I set it to 150, I'm there. So it's going to depend a little bit on the image that you have, like how much detail it has and how sharp it is, and also how big you want to print. But this will take care of most things. If this is not looking sharp enough, or if it's running out of pixel, later in our workflow we would actually take this image and we'd upsample it and figure out how to give it just a little bit more sharpening as we upsampled. But for right now, I'm just going to let this stand. Let's type in 300. It's like that's a pretty nice scan for a 4x5. We'll just leave it there. I didn't do anything. I just kind of temporarily put it in this this resolution. And now we're actually ready to start doing our color correction. So this is okay. Right now, let's go back to image size just to see how big our file is. So right now, this is kind of what a normal 16-bit color neg scan from the Imicon scanner would look like. And I think these scans are very different. I think there's a little bit more softness and interesting, smooth illumination in the highlights with the Epson scanner. But I think both of them are really great scanners and good way to go. So we are, again, this is kind of about where we're going to start our workflow, comparable to the Imicon. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually make my first tonal correction, and we're going to do a little bit more noise reduction. And to do that, I'm going to go into Adobe Camera Raw. So I'm going to right click on this layer. I'm going to convert it to a Smart Object layer. And what the Smart Object layer allows me to do is it allows me to keep editing in Camera Raw with the same sets of edits. If I didn't make this image a Smart Object layer, each time I went back into Camera Raw, I'd be editing over from the beginning of each correction. So again, this is a big old file, takes a little while. Here we go. Up here in the main menu, filter, I'm going to select Camera Raw filter. And this looks pretty flat and pretty boring. One of the things that I think is really important for students to see is to see the image with a little bit too much contrast in the midtones instead of using the contrast slider. If I do that, it's like, oh yeah, it starts to get better. But what I encourage everyone to do is set the contrast to maybe like -10, -20, and add some of the really beneficial midtone contrast, which is the clarity slider. Now, this adds a lot more contrast to the midtones where it's really hard to actually target and apply contrast. And I think this tends to benefit, really improve the quality of most images. So I always start out with just a little bit less contrast than I feel like I might like, a little bit more clarity, midtone contrast. And in the latest versions of Photoshop and Adobe Camera Raw and also Lightroom, there's this new filter. If you go to the effects panel, it's called Dehaze. And this, if you watch the little histogram, okay, if I put, this is a huge amount, don't put this amount, much amount. This does something that's like the clarity slider in that it applies contrast to the midtone areas, but it also does it in a way so that it actually makes the image a little bit darker. It actually kind of pushes stuff towards the shadow end. Now, I would go very gently with this, especially at the beginning, but I found that I like to add maybe 15 points of this and maybe 20 points of clarity before we even begin to set up the tonality of this image. And again, what this does is it adds a lot of contrast to the midtones. So right now, this is kind of a tricky image. It's tricky because the rest of this image is pretty flat. I've got this one nasty little highlight right here. This is what we might refer to as a specular highlight. In other words, it's a bright, reflective, uh, shiny object like chrome bumper, or you could also say it's maybe like a light bulb, a bare light bulb in a scene, or the sun. Those are things we refer to as spectral highlights. This is an area that's kind of okay to actually let clip. I've got the clipping turned on in Camera Raw, and you can see it's like, oh, that is clipping. If I'm actually able to measure that, get my eyedropper tool out. If I measure that, it is telling me, if I look right up here in the readout, that that is 255 in the red, green, and blue channels. So that is what we call clipped. That is off our workable range in the highlight end, and I will not be able to correct that if I let it remain this way. So that is like the one area that we're actually going to kind of ignore. If you've got a piece of dust, it might give you a reading like this. You might, I think it's probably a good idea to leave these clipping warnings on at this stage. And, you know, if you see some other pieces of dust up in the sky, they might also be clipping. Let's go up here to our histogram, and let's look at what we want to do. Right now, this little piece of dust is actually showing up right here on the histogram. This stuff is probably all this white concrete mixer. And if I didn't have that concrete mixer, like the true highlight of this scene, apart from all the white bright stuff, would start about right here. Okay, so ideally, if I didn't have this bright white stuff, what I would do is I would start out. We never want to use the exposure slider. These controls are kind of wacky. I've detailed them in other videos. So basically we want to start with the white slider and the black slider, and we're going to set our endpoints here. To set the endpoints, I would basically move the white slider, and I'm not even going to look at the image right now. I'm actually just going to get this close to being over towards the edge. And when I do that, and when I maybe give just a little bit of contrast to the shadows, it's like this looks pretty decent. Okay, this actually looks maybe just a little bit contrasty, but it looks about the right overall brightness. Now, the problem that I've got here is that I've got this nasty thing right here, and it clipped like crazy. So I'm not going to be able to set that as high as I might like. I'm going to go over as much as I can. And this is a situation that happens a fair amount. You get one nasty little piece of highlight that prevents you from actually setting the brightness in a way that might be very beneficial by just moving the white slider to the right. In other words, getting the actual true highlight information over here. So we're going to have to do that in a different way. The way that we do that when we've got a problem like this is we actually want to use the white slider and figure out right where we want to leave that highlight point, and think about an area that we would want to clip if there is one. If we don't want to clip anything, we're going to just keep bringing this back until it is actually safe. Now, there is another way to kind of fake a clean and safe highlight, and that is to use these guys. Okay, if you're doing everything right, it would be really nice to use only the white and black sliders. If we start using these, really complicated, weird algorithms start happening to the image. You know, if we don't use them to excess, it's not going to ruin, you know, it won't cause problems, it won't ruin the image. If I do this, start pulling this back, you'll notice that it pulls the quarter tones back, and it has an algorithm there that kind of rescues messed up highlights. But it does so in a way that kind of flattens the whole image. So I'm going to take this idea of like trying to rescue the highlights, and I'm going to try and fix our basic exposure. These are really wacky controls, and again, I would just add midtone contrast and try and use the blacks and whites. The thing that I wish we had, which we've had in previous versions of Lightroom and Camera Raw, is we used to have a midtone slider. In other words, we used to be able to push the midtones up. Well, it's actually kind of cool that that's gone, because it makes us have to act like, you know, grown-ups and learn how to use the curve. The curve, if you don't know how to use it, it's like using levels. I adjust my highlights here, my shadows there. If I go up on this axis, I add brightness to the midtones, and down on that axis, I add darkness to the midtones. What I want to do is I'm going to cheat a little bit. Okay, I'm actually going to do this thing, which is kind of an advanced thing. I'm going to take my highlight right here. You can see that nasty little highlight. I'm actually just going to cheat. I'm going to bring my very brightest highlight point down by like about 3 or 4 points. You can see on the output rating right there. And what I've done is I have actually myself cheated and put fake detail right there. This is actually not a bad thing to do if you've got a specular little highlight. One of the reasons I want to do this, if I'm making an inkjet print, I'll get a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of density right there. And otherwise, if I didn't do that, I might have, if I'm looking at the print, from the side and I'm examining the gloss of the print, everything will be nice and glossy, and then I'll have this like little tiny weird recessed pit-like area. So this ensures that I get just a tiny little bit of detail on my brightest highlight. The next thing I'm going to do, now that I've rescued my highlight, is I'm going to pretend that my curve is, oh, come on. There we go. Pretend that my curve is my midtone slider. And I'm going to actually just do a slight brightening of the midtones. And then I'm going to just add a little bit of contrast by dropping the shadow area just a little bit. So this is starting to get the image about back to where it wants to be. I feel like now it could actually, it's got about the right overall brightness, but it can maybe use just a little bit more contrast. And I want to be careful with this contrast not to, cause problems with my shadows, and also make sure I don't clip my highlights again. Now, I think it's probably a good idea to use the shadow slider and not let anything except something that should be pure black clip. So I'm going to smooth this over a little bit to the right and just watch the clipping. I'm going to be able to add more contrast in Photoshop. So if it's a little flat and open in the highlights here, that's actually fine. Okay, so the next thing I want to do, since this is scanned, none of these other tabs are really going to make much difference, or at least the lens correction is not going to. I'm going to go to the Detail tab and make sure that I'm not sharpening anything. I'm going to turn all these sliders off. But if I've got an image that's a little bit underexposed, in the old days we used to have specific programs that were designed to remove the noise from scans of color slides and also color negatives specifically. If I go in really close, I might be able to see like some of this information is captured badly and it's like noisy. In this image, this is such a great film. As long as I expose pretty well, I really haven't got much noise that you can see. But if I did have some noise, I would add a little bit of the color noise reduction here. There's special programs that you can get to do this, but I find that just using the noise reduction inside Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom actually works pretty well. Since I don't really need anything here, I'm actually just not even going to turn this one on. I would go to your darkest shadow, and if you've got some noise that you can actually, you think you might see in the final print, I would use a little bit of the noise reduction here. Okay, if that's not the case, basically we're going to do our main tonal correction. You'll notice I haven't tried to do any color correction yet. I just want to make sure that everything is nice and protected. A little bit of contrast, a little bit of brightness in the midtones. We've got our contrast on the way. We're going to go back into Photoshop. So now I'm actually going to start my color correction workflow. Now, for color correction, I think one of the things that you should do if you want to become better at color correction is there's a pretty good series of video tutorials on lynda.com. It's called Color Correction, and the author is Taz Talley. And he does a really good job of giving people some information and experience about how to color correct by setting the endpoints and how to color correct by applying color sampler points and how and when to do that. And I think that's the best source. So I'm actually going to do a very simple color correction in this particular situation. And one of the things that I really like about Color Perfect is that it makes color correcting very easy, especially at least the part where we'd use curves or levels. Okay, I'm going to bring up an adjustment layer. If you're comfortable using levels, use levels. If you want to try curves, that would be what I would actually suggest. So instead of using what we call the global curve, this is the global RGB curve. If I move that up or down, you can see I move the entire image contrast. To do individual to do color correction, we want to go to the individual curves. Right now, you'll notice the color is red, and when I do this, instead of moving all the colors, I actually move the individual component of however much red is in this image. So if I move the color, move the midpoint of the curve up, I'm adding red. If I move it out, I'm subtracting mostly green, and subtracting mostly red, which is leaving the image a little bit green, but you can also see there's still a fair amount of blue there. What I would suggest that you, one of the things that I like to do rather with this color correction method is I like to try and set the endpoints by using an old method that people used to use using levels back in the beginning. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this out, see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Let's go in. The idea behind this method of color correction is that as long as I've got just one light source in the image, in other words, there's not tungsten light in this scene where it's mostly daylight, as long as I've got one light source, I can, and my scanner and my profile are accurate, I can basically just move the individual red, green, and blue highlight and also shadow points in to where the information starts, and I should get a pretty decent basic color correction. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. I'm going to actually just take this slider, and instead of using the curve slider up here, when you've got a more advanced version of Photoshop, you can actually just grab the bottom. And I'm going to move it in till it's just like one point in front of that first little dot of information. I'm going to do the same thing for green. You can see that dot right there. Now that dot is probably that little bright spot on our histogram. And I do it with that one. Okay, and so now, zoom back out, I'm going to turn the eyeball on and off. And not only do we make the highlights a little bit brighter, quite a bit brighter, we also kind of clean this thing up a little bit. Color's getting a little bit less blue-green. If I go back and I look at the global position, I can see, oh yeah, look, we got rid of some blue. We added more red than green, and blue is behind the green. Okay, so basically we got rid of blue and added a little bit of red, and we added a little bit of green so that the thing didn't get to be too cyan. Don't even worry about those colors. What we want to do is just go back and set the endpoints, and then we'll do the rest by eye. So let me zoom in again. The shadows can be a little bit trickier, and one of the reasons that they are a little bit trickier is that, you know, really depends on how much contrast you've got in a given scene, and also depends on, you know, what actually needs to be a shadow in your image. Most shadows, it's rare that an image has something that is pure black. And I'm taking a little test drive to see what I've got that might actually be pure black. In this situation, I feel like the areas underneath this machinery, those might actually be areas that could be pure black. What I'm going to do now is, instead of moving this thing into a given point, is I'm going to try and visually pick spots down here, and I'm going to do that. Let's see if I can do this. I'm going to actually hold down the Option key and grab this little pointer, and when I do, you'll notice that the image turns red. Anything that's not red, shows up as black, is actually been clipped. It's a value below 0. So ideally, if I can identify, I'm going to go to the green channel now, if I can identify similar areas and clip them, the similar areas that I think should be a neutral black area, and I'm going to pick on this little piece of black plastic underneath that little forklift thingy. If I clip them and make the same amount of clipping happen in that spot, I need to identify that spot. I'm trying to make that one little square right here all be the same. I'm going to go to the blue channel, see what we've got. And if I clip it so that it's all about the same amount, let's see, that's about a full square. Okay, and let's zoom back out. That's quite a bit better color. Okay, if I do this, and I'm just looking my eye, it seems like it's just a little bit green in the midtones, maybe just a little bit blue. Um, Let me just check and make sure that each one of those little, again, I'm looking right here at that little red square. Each one of the squares is approximately the same shape. I probably need to do a little bit of adjustment by eye in this situation. Like I'm thinking that maybe the red, oh, I bumped the red. Actually, I didn't move the red. Maybe I could lose 1 or 2 points of red. And that makes it quite a bit better. Yeah, maybe even one more. Okay, so I feel like that is actually really quite good. Maybe it's a little bit red or green in the midtones. In a lot of situations where I'm using Color Perfect, whoops, I bumped it. I will set the endpoints like I've just done, and then I'll either use the down, I'll put a curve point in the midpoint of the curve. I'll move it down or move it up just a point or two in each one of these primary colors. And that generally is going to get me very, very close. So I think we're very close right now. I'm going to title this one my Global Color Correction, GCC. And when I say global color correction, basically some areas might have local shifts. What I'm using this curve to do is I'm color correcting the entire image in the best way that I can without causing any problems. Some of these areas along the edges might need a little bit of help. And one of the things that generally happens, unfortunately, with color negatives when it's processed is that the edges are going to have a little bit different cast than the interior. So when I say that things are looking kind of clean in the midtones, part of me is looking out here. I'm also feeling like the edges are a little bit blue and green. So if you're saying, Steve, you can't see color anymore, that might be true, but I'm kind of concentrating my eyes mostly right in here. I know that with most color neg images, I'm going to probably do a little bit of local work by taking out the blue and also some green along the edges. So I'm kind of thinking mostly in here. And now the next biggest adjustment that I think we need to make is the colors are close, but they're still a little bit off, and they need a hue saturation adjustment layer. And when we use hue saturation adjustment layer, it's a really good idea not to go to this position. This is the global position or the master position. If I do this, basically I increase the contrast of the entire thing. Now, the hue saturation is a tool where you actually want to correct color. You don't really want to add saturation. We're going to add saturation after we get everything really neutral. So if this looks really boring and horrible to you, hang on, we're going to add a little bit more contrast, which will add saturation, and perhaps we'll add some vibrance, which is like the good way to add saturation to an image. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the reds, and this is a really complicated subject. It kind of deserves its own series of videos, but I'm just going to really give you the shortened version. Most of the time when I open up an image that's Kodak, I'm going to take the red slider, and I'm probably going to either change it towards a slightly more warmish red. Very rarely will I make the red more magenta. So if you don't know which one is which, it's probably just a good idea to actually go for a little joyride. It's like, oh, that's red with more magenta. Here, oh, that's like red with more orange, and now it also is getting to be almost a yellow red. Okay, that's way too much. What we want to do probably in most situations is maybe just move the red 1, 2, or 3, sometimes even 4 chunks to the right. Our goal with hue saturation is to fix the primary colors and then also fix how much saturation in the individual primary colors exists in the image. In a lot of Kodak images, sometimes the reds are more powerful than the greens or the blues. So this is a two-part thing. First, we're going to go through and we're going to try and make the colors more accurate. Now, when I say more accurate, this is a tricky thing because you know, I was at this scene. I know what that orange is supposed to look like. I know what that orange safety fence is supposed to look like. And what I'm saying is, like, right now at 0, okay, let's put this to 0. It's a very, specific call, and it's kind of hard to see unless you spend a lot of time doing this. But that orange looks to be like the red part of that orange has too much magenta. So I'm going to move this just a little bit to the right, and as I do, it's very hard to see. So I'm going to turn the eyeball on and off, and if you look at their orange safety vest, then you look here, it's like it gets slightly warmer. Now, if you're working on someone with skin tone, this makes quite a bit, much more dramatic result. You'll be able to see it quite a bit more. The yellows, I'm going to do the same thing. Now, the yellows, or rather what I try and do when I use hue saturation, is I try and adjust the warm colors together. So this is a first initial step with the reds, and with the yellows, I'm going to actually see if I can make both the reds and yellows a little bit better. Like that's adding, magenta or red to the yellow. That's adding green and more yellow to the yellow. And you can see somewhere in there is like a sweet spot where all the colors kind of snap together. Again, you need to know sort of what this thing looks like. But again, it shouldn't be maybe more than 3-4 points, either in the plus or the minus. So I'm going to go like 2 points minus here. All right, now the thing that's tricky about this is we want to do our reds and yellows, and then we'll probably want to do our cyans and blues. So do the warm colors and then the cool colors. And when I do the cyan, I'm thinking, okay, cyan has got a lot of blue in it, but it's also mostly blue-green. So I'm going to do a little bit of adjustment here, and then I'm also going to do the blues. And what I'm trying to do with these two colors is I'm going to go back and forth a lot, but I'm going to try and I'm going to try and make my blue look like the most accurate blue. And the way that I do that is if I go for a huge swing to the right on this, my blue is, I'm adding a lot of red. It's becoming like a royal blue. If I go to the left, I'm adding a lot of green. It's becoming like a turquoise blue. I want to figure out what the sky looks best as and what these blues look best as. And I don't want to, if I do that too much, it's like, oh yeah, that's kind of fake looking. It's like, becoming, like a badly printed postcard. You get to kind of you have to sort of have a preference and sort of experiment and know what you want. I typically try and find the point where the blue is like most neutral or most looks like the scene, and then I'll go back and I'll retweak the cyan so that it's sort of, not messing anything up that's going on with the blue colors, and then I'll go back and do one more time here. Okay, so once I've done the reds and the yellows, I do the cyans and blues. Occasionally, very rarely, you've got something that actually shows up as the Photoshop sees as magenta. If you do, I would investigate that. One of the main problems of using hue saturation is that the way that the control is set up, most of the yellows affect the greens to a large extent. So I'm going to move this over here. I want you to look in here and in here, and I'm going to take the yellow for a huge joyride. Okay, so one of the things that happens often is if I adjust the yellow to make the warmer parts of the yellow look correct, I can sometimes mess up the greens. Now, if this happens, this is like the first sign that you should probably think about making a mask. Or maybe perhaps just not adjusting the yellow completely so that you mess up the greens, and then go deal with both the yellow and the green with a separate mask and also adjustment layer. All right, in this case, I'm just going to leave it as a little bit on this side. I'm going to see what I can do to fix the greens. One of the reasons I skipped the greens initially is that the greens don't actually target a lot of greens, actually. So I find that often I'm trying to figure out how to do my best job that I can correcting the warm colors, and then maybe see what's going on with the green. If I do need to do the greens, I typically make a separate layer for that and use a selection tool like selective color to select the greens and fix them after I fix the rest of the image. So that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind as you're doing the overall correction. Now the last part of this, it's really complicated. I'm going to go in and say, hey, my reds I think are not saturated enough. So typically we're going to go and desaturate the reds, but in this particular case I think they need just a little bit of a boost. Now when I do this, a lot of things happen that are kind of hard to keep track of. If if I just move this 20 points to the right, it's like, wow, reds are really taking off, or at least these oranges are. Tiny hints of red in the grass and some unwanted reds in these trees. When I increase this, a good way to start out is to take the lightness slider and move it right underneath. Okay, this is an increase in the reds, but it is a neutral lightness and darkness effect. Now, what I mean by neutral lightness and darkness change is that if I leave this set in like 0 position, I move this to the right, I'm actually I'm actually kind of adding a little tiny bit of black ink or blackness to that color. If I keep moving this down on the lightness scale, like I've got this color correction made, I've got this color increase set, but because I'm adding like black to that correction, it really makes the reds recede. Okay, this is neutral. That's a boost of color that's slightly receding. That's a boost of color. We are slightly lightening it, and it's maybe kind of moving forward, at least in terms of the way that it sits with all the other colors. So when I add contrast, I think it's a really good idea to figure out, like, I want to add a significant amount of red, but I'm going to bring this here. And do I want that red to kind of sit or maybe move forward a little bit? This is a very tricky thing to figure out, and it's going to take a lot of experience. Again, I would do the warm colors with the cool colors. I feel like our yellows need a significant boost. So I'm going to actually just take a wild guess and say, let's give them like 15 or so. And then I bring it out here, and that's neutral. And that's a little bit of a boost with a little bit of darkening. And that's a little bit of a boost with a little bit of lightening. Okay? All right, so I'm going to add quite a bit more yellow. You can see that's boost with a lot of lightness. I'm going to leave it just a little bit behind there. Now with these cyans and greens, I feel like the midday sun, especially the summer up in the mountains, is a little bit crazy with the blue, if you will. So in this case, I'm actually going to take the cyans and I'm going to desaturate them on purpose and overly add lightness to actually make them be lighter in relationship to all the other colors. Okay. All right, so this is a good basic template. This image, we actually need to fix our greens. But I'm going to move forward. Once you get these guys kind of set where they need to be, the next thing I might do is I might add just a little bit of contrast overall by adding a curve. Just a little bump up in the quarter tones, a little drop in 3/4 tones. I'm going to keep my midtones nice and bright. And I feel like this is getting very close to what the scene was like. Again, the edges are a little messed up, and I feel like I've got a little bit too much red over here. I've got a little too much. Now that I've fixed the hue saturation, it's actually a good idea to go back and maybe tweak little fine points of your initial global color correction, and I feel like the red was just a little bit too much. So I'm going to pull it down like 2 points in the middle, and I think that gets to be quite a bit better. I think maybe I want to see what losing 1 more point of green looks like. In this case, I've lowered red and green together. I've added more blue to the midtones. I think that actually looks quite a bit better. If I feel like I've got too much red and I do my very best tweaking in the midtones, I may have chosen incorrectly with my hue saturation. So instead of boosting these reds, maybe I went the wrong way. Maybe I've got too much red overall. Maybe I should try reducing this just a little bit. Again, I'm going to make it be the same thing. And I actually feel like that works a little bit better. Maybe not quite that much. So there's like kind of an overall red presence that you can control with the overall saturation, as well as correcting the individual hue. So I feel like this is in a much better place. Maybe it could use a little bit more of a saturation boost. I feel like I'd like to see the reds pop more, but when I do, the reds are kind of showing up all over the entire image in a way that I don't like. So this is like a good idea, or a good indication that we're kind of getting close to maybe having a decent completion of the global hue saturation adjustment layer. I'm going to now go to Vibrance, and I'm just going to turn up the entire saturation of the image. And when I do it, this is what we say, this is like good saturation. It tends to increase colors that are not already oversaturated and tends not to inflame skin tones. So I feel like with that actually does a really pretty nice job. Again, I feel like I've got some greenness over here, and I need to do a little bit of edge burning. Also, that is kind of unfortunate. I got a little bit of flare. We're going to have to fix that with a little bit of Photoshop, a little bit of a mask. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to maybe just take a little bit out of these edges. So I'm going to make temporary correction for the edge. And what I need to do is, this is a two-part thing. I'm actually going to visualize making the correction in just this area, and then I'm going to take this layer mask and I'm going to fill it with black, and then I'm going to very slowly paint the correction back in. So I want to correct it maybe just a little too much. So I'm going to go to the green channel. I'm going to activate my little finger or targeted adjustment tool. And when I click, it's going to put a little curve point about where that shift is. And I'm just going to use my down arrow key, like 3, 4, 5. Whoa, there we go. That's a little too much. Okay, I also feel like it's probably a little bit blue on those edges, so I'm going to go to the same place, and I'll take out a little bit of blue. And I want to actually have this be just slightly reddish, but the right amount of green and blue. Alright, let's say that is close. You can see the rest of the image is looking terrible. That's okay. We want to paint just a little tiny bit of effect of this correction into our edges. So now I'm going to hit the Command I with this layer mask selected. That gets rid of the entire correction. Now I'm going to select the brush tool, and I'm going to hold down the Option and Control keys at the same time, and I'm mouse clicking and dragging to the right, and I get a preview of what my brush is like. And in this case, I want a big fluffy brush, and I like using setting the brush this way because I can kind of visualize like this outer portion of what the brush is doing. Okay, and what I want to do is I'm going to set the opacity of this brush down to something like 5. I want to work very slowly with the soft outer edge of this brush, and I'm going to do like 2 or 3 keystrokes at a time, brush strokes rather. I've got it on white paint, so theoretically, okay, that's very, very slight. Let's actually turn it up a little bit more so you guys can see it on the video. Let's go to like 17%. Okay. Now you can see that this is starting to match what's going on in here. This has got a little bit of a problem. It actually needs to be burned in by itself. I'm going to concentrate a little bit more on that edge. And this is one way to deal with those nasty little outer edge contrast problems. Okay, so I'll work these areas up here. You'll notice that it's a little bit lighter up here. What I'll do after I've got the color kind of fixed is I'll make another curve adjustment layer, and I'm just going to take the entire curve and make it, you know, generally darker in a way, just about like this. I'll do the same thing. I'll hit Command I, and again I'll work with a low opacity brush, kind of big brush with fuzzy edges, to kind of just hold those edges in. And I'm working way too fast, but this video's gone on way too long. And sort of the same thing up there, just a little bit of brushing. Okay. Alright, so I think I'm getting close to being somewhat done. There's a few little bright spots that I feel like could be burned in, and maybe I could dodge this and also add a little bit more contrast and perhaps clean up the color just a little bit more. but this gives a good idea of the general workflow. And I think color with this Color Perfect and ViewScan is actually really great. So enjoy.